In May of 1940, the most powerful army in Western Europe collapsed in barely 6 weeks. France, the nation that had resisted 4 years of butchery in the trenches during the First World War, fell to the German forces with a speed that left the whole world stunned. The French generals, the British strategists, even the German commanders themselves, could not believe what was actually happening. How was it possible that a military power with millions of soldiers, with the most sophisticated defensive line ever built, with tanks and airplanes in amounts comparable to those of the enemy, would crumble like a house of cards before the German advance? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to give a good like to the video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments from where you are listening to us and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all parts of the world. The answer they have told us for decades is simple: the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, a revolutionary tactic that combined fast tanks, coordinated aviation, and radio communications to pierce through enemy lines before they could react. But what if I told you that the Blitzkrieg, just as we understand it today, is largely a myth created after the war? What if I revealed to you that the Germans themselves never used that term to describe their military doctrine? What would happen if you discovered that the German victory in France was on the verge of becoming the greatest military disaster in the history of Germany? This is the story that they have not told you. The story of how a desperate gamble, a series of catastrophic errors on the part of the Allies, and an extraordinary amount of good luck combined to produce one of the most surprising military collapses of all the times. It is the story of generals who ignored warnings, of plans that almost failed, of decisions taken at the last moment that changed the course of the Second World War. But let us start from the beginning. To understand what happened in May of 1940, we must go back more than 2 decades, to the smoking ashes of the First World War. The 11th of November of 1918, at 11 in the morning, the cannons finally fell silent on their Western Front. After 4 years, 3 months and 14 days of combat, the Great War had ended. France had survived, but the price paid was almost incomprehensible. Close to 1,400,000 French soldiers had died. Another 4,200,000 had been wounded. Entire regions of the northeast of the country had been left converted into lunar wastelands, artillery craters, and rusted barbed wire, where before there were crop fields and prosperous villages. The generation that had fought in Verdun, in the Somme, in the Marne, was marked forever by the experience. These veterans, many of them mutilated physically and psychologically, swore that they would never again allow something like this to happen again. And this determination, this collective trauma, would shape French military policy during the following 2 decades in ways that nobody could foresee. What lesson did the French extract from the First World War? The answer seemed obvious. The defense had triumphed over the attack. During 4 years, millions of soldiers had tried to break the enemy lines through frontal assaults, and millions had died in the attempt. The machine guns, the artillery, and the trenches had converted the battlefield into a death trap for anyone who tried to advance. The only sensible strategy, concluded the French strategists, was to build defences so formidable that no attacker could overcome them. From this conviction was born the Maginot Line, one of the most ambitious military engineering projects in history, named in honour of André Maginot, the Minister of War who promoted its construction. This chain of fortifications would extend along the Franco-German border from Switzerland to Luxembourg. The project began in 1929 and would continue throughout the decade of the 30s, consuming a significant portion of the French military budget. The numbers are astonishing. The main line consisted of more than 140 large fortified works, each one of them a subterranean fortress capable of housing between 200 and more than 1,000 soldiers. These works were connected by more than 100 kilometers of tunnels, equipped with electric railways, to transport munitions and supplies. The reinforced concrete walls reached thicknesses of up to 3.5 meters, designed to resist the direct impact of the heaviest artillery projectiles of the epoch. But the Maginot Line was much more than simple concrete. It was an integrated defensive system that included retractable towers for cannons, armoured cupolas for machine guns, ventilation systems with filters against poisonous gases, its own electrical generators, underground hospitals, even recreational facilities to maintain the morale of the garrisons during prolonged sieges. Some of the largest forts were several stories deep, with the habitable areas located so far down that the soldiers needed elevators to reach the surface. The total cost of the Maginot Line equaled approximately 3 billion francs of the epoch, a colossal sum that represented a significant fraction of the French gross domestic product. But for the French leaders, the expense was justified. The line would not only protect the national territory from a direct invasion, but it would also free up troops that otherwise would have to be stationed on the border, allowing the bulk of the French army to be deployed wherever necessary. There was, however, a fundamental problem with this strategy, a problem that critics pointed out from the beginning, but that the defenders of the Maginot Line dismissed with arguments that, in retrospect, seem astonishingly naive. The Maginot Line did not cover the entire French border with Germany. It ended abruptly at the border with Belgium and Luxembourg. Why? The reasons were multiple. First, extending the fortifications along the Belgian border would have been enormously costly, since the terrain was less favourable for the construction of subterranean fortifications. Second, and more importantly, the French did not want to offend their Belgian allies by building defences that implied they did not trust them. But the most significant reason was geographical. The French strategists believed that the Ardennes, the mountainous and densely forested region that extended through Belgium, Luxembourg, and the northeast of France, was impassable for a modern army. The roads were narrow and winding, the valleys were deep and difficult to cross. The forests were so dense that any force that tried to traverse them would be stuck for days, vulnerable to counterattacks. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, who had become the most respected military figure in France, declared that the Ardennes were impenetrable for armoured formations. This evaluation was repeated and accepted by practically the entire French High Command. It was an article of faith, a certainty that nobody seriously questioned. But was this evaluation correct? The Germans also had opinions about the Ardennes, and not everyone agreed with the French evaluation. To understand the German perspective, we must examine how the German army had evolved after the defeat of 1918. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed draconian restrictions on the German armed forces. The army was limited to 100,000 soldiers. The possession of tanks, military airplanes, and heavy artillery was prohibited. The navy was reduced to a fraction of its former size. Germany, in theory, had been permanently disarmed. But the restrictions, paradoxically, had an unexpected effect. The small German army of the Weimar Republic, known as the Reichswehr, became an elite corps. Only the best candidates were accepted. The training was rigorous, and most importantly, the German officers dedicated the interwar years to obsessively analysing the lessons of the First World War. What had gone wrong? Why had the armies gotten stuck in the trenches during 4 years? How could the stalemate be broken in a future war? These questions consumed a generation of German military thinkers, and the answers they developed would transform warfare forever. One of the most influential thinkers was Hans von Seeckt, Commander-in-Chief of the Reichswehr from 1920 to 1926. Von Seeckt believed that the key to victory in modern warfare was mobility. The armies of the First World War had failed because they had become too large and too slow. Millions of soldiers crammed into trenches could not maneuver, could not exploit the breaches in the enemy lines, could not maintain the momentum of an attack. The solution, argued von Seeckt, was to create a smaller but much more mobile army. An army that could concentrate forces rapidly at decisive points, break the enemy defences, and penetrate deeply into enemy territory before the opponent could react. This concept, although von Seeckt never used the term, would lay the foundations for what would later be called maneuver warfare. Another crucial thinker was Heinz Guderian, an infantry officer who had become obsessed with the potential of armoured vehicles. Guderian had studied the writings of British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, who argued that tanks could revolutionise warfare if they were used correctly. Instead of dispersing the tanks along the front to support the infantry, as the Allies had done in the First World War, Guderian proposed concentrating them in massive formations that could break the enemy lines and advance independently. But Guderian went further than Fuller and Liddell Hart. He understood that tanks alone were not enough. For the armoured formations to be truly effective, they needed the coordinated support of other arms. Motorised infantry had to closely follow the tanks to consolidate the gains. Self-propelled artillery had to provide mobile support fire, and crucially, aviation had to act as flying artillery, attacking enemy positions and disorganising the communications and supplies of the adversary. This vision of combined arms, with tanks, motorised infantry, artillery and aviation working together in close coordination, would be the true secret of the German success in 1940. It was not simply speed, although speed was important. It was the integration of different elements into a cohesive system that could adapt rapidly to the changing circumstances of the battlefield. Guderian published his ideas in a book titled Achtung, Panzer, in 1937. The book was widely read, not only in Germany, but also in other countries, including France. But while the Germans took Guderian's ideas seriously and began to reorganize their army accordingly, the French largely ignored them. Why? Part of the answer has to do with institutional inertia. The high commands of any army tend to prepare for the last war instead of the next one. The generals who had earned their stripes in the trenches of the First World War were naturally skeptical of radical theories that contradicted their experience. They had seen tanks up close and knew they were slow, unreliable, and vulnerable. How could these temperamental machines revolutionize warfare? Furthermore, the French military doctrine emphasized the methodical battle. According to this philosophy, military operations had to be carefully planned and executed in a deliberate manner, with each phase completed before moving on to the next. The idea of launching armoured formations into the unknown, without securing the flanks or coordinating with the infantry, seemed reckless and irresponsible. There were also political factors. France was a democracy with a fragmented political system, where governments changed frequently, and military budgets were the subject of intense debates. Reorganising the French army along the lines proposed by theorists like Guderian would have required massive investments and an institutional transformation that few politicians were willing to undertake. Ironically, France had its own defender of armoured warfare, Charles de Gaulle. This officer, then a relatively unknown colonel, published in 1934 a book titled Vers l'armée de métier, Toward the Professional Army, in which he argued that France needed a professional armoured corps capable of carrying out rapid offensive operations. De Gaulle even presented his ideas to the French Parliament, but he was ignored. His superiors considered him an ambitious nonconformist, and his proposals were dismissed as dangerous fantasies that contradicted conventional wisdom. Meanwhile, in Germany, things are moving in a very different direction. In January of 1933, Adolf Hitler was named Chancellor of Germany. The new Nazi regime immediately began to dismantle the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. In 1935, Hitler publicly announced the existence of the Luftwaffe, the new German Air Force, and reintroduced compulsory military service. In 1936, German troops reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland, openly violating the treaty. The Allies protested but did not act. This passivity convinced Hitler that he could move forward with his plans without serious consequences, and he had ambitions that went far beyond simply restoring Germany's borders prior to 1918. German rearmament accelerated at a dizzying pace. Between 1933 and 1939, the German military budget multiplied by more than 10. New factories were built to produce tanks, airplanes, and weapons of all kinds. The army grew from 100,000 soldiers to more than 1 million by 1938, and would continue growing until it surpassed 3 million when the war began. The 1st Panzer Divisions, the armoured formations that Guderian had dreamed of, were created in 1935. Initially they were small and were equipped with light tanks that were more useful for training than for real combat. But the organisational structure was in place, and the German officers were developing the tactics and doctrines they would employ in the war. The first real test came in March of 1938, when Germany annexed Austria in what became known as the Anschluss. Although the operation did not encounter military resistance, it revealed serious logistical problems. The German armoured columns that advanced toward Vienna suffered numerous mechanical breakdowns, and the roads became congested with stalled vehicles. If Austria had resisted, the outcome could have been very different. The Germans took note of these deficiencies and worked to correct them, but logistical problems would be a recurring theme throughout the entire war, a reminder that even the most modern and best-trained army had real limitations. In September of 1938, the Sudeten crisis brought Europe to the brink of war. Hitler demanded the annexation of the German-speaking regions of Czechoslovakia, threatening war if his demands were not met. At the Munich conference, the prime ministers of Great Britain and France, Neville Chamberlain and Édouard Daladier, acceded to Hitler's demands in exchange for a promise of peace. The policy of appeasement, as this strategy became known, was widely criticised later as an act of cowardice that only emboldened Hitler. But at the time, it had a comprehensible logic. The memories of the First World War were fresh, and few wanted to repeat that butchery. Moreover, neither France nor Great Britain were prepared for war in 1938, and buying time to rearm seemed a prudent option. However, the time gained also benefited Germany. In March of 1939, Hitler violated the Munich agreements by occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia. It became clear that his ambitions were not limited to uniting the German-speaking peoples, but that he sought the domination of Central Europe. Finally, Great Britain and France committed themselves to defend Poland if Germany attacked it. The Polish crisis arrived in the summer of 1939. Hitler demanded the return of the free city of Danzig and a corridor through Polish territory to connect Germany with East Prussia. When Poland rejected these demands, supported by British and French guarantees, the stage was set for war. But before attacking Poland, Hitler needed to make sure that he would not have to fight on two fronts simultaneously. The 23rd of August of 1939, the world was stunned when Germany and the Soviet Union announced the signing of a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as it became known, included secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. This agreement between two ideologically opposed regimes surprised everyone. The Nazis had built their movement on anti-communism, and Stalin had denounced fascism as the mortal enemy of the proletariat. But geopolitics triumphed over ideology. Hitler obtained the freedom to act in the West without fear of Soviet intervention. Stalin obtained time and territory, including the eastern half of Poland, the Baltic states and Bessarabia. The 1st of September of 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, German forces crossed the Polish border. Luftwaffe airplanes bombed Polish cities and airfields. Armoured columns advanced towards the interior of the country. The Second World War had begun. The Polish campaign was brief and brutal. The Polish army, although brave, was fatally outnumbered and technologically outmatched. Its cavalry divisions, still an important component of its forces, were almost useless against the German tanks. Its air force was largely destroyed in the first days of the war, leaving the army without aerial cover, and the Soviet attack from the east, which began the 17th of September, sealed the fate of Poland. In less than 5 weeks, organised resistance had ended. Warsaw fell the 27th of September after a fierce bombardment that left the city in ruins. The last Polish army surrendered the 6th of October. Poland had ceased to exist as an independent state. The speed of the German victory astounded the world and terrified the Allies. Journalists searched for a word to describe what they had witnessed, and they found one that captured the essence of the campaign: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. But here we must pause to examine a myth that has persisted for decades. The term Blitzkrieg was not an official German military doctrine. The Germans never used that word to describe their operations. There was no Blitzkrieg manual, nor Blitzkrieg training courses, nor an agreed definition of what Blitzkrieg exactly implied. The term had appeared occasionally in German military writings during the 30s, but as a general description of a short and decisive war, not as a specific tactic. It was the Western press, seeking to explain the inexplicable collapse of Poland, that popularized the term and made it synonymous with German warfare. Why does this distinction matter? Because the myth of the Blitzkrieg obscured the reality of what had actually happened in Poland and what would happen in France. The Allies, fascinated by the idea of a revolutionary doctrine, did not critically examine the true strengths and weaknesses of the German army. They did not see the logistical problems that had plagued the Polish campaign, nor the divisions within the German high command about how the war should be conducted. And most importantly, they did not understand that German success in Poland was due as much to Polish weaknesses as to German strengths. Poland was a large but poor country, with a partially modernized army and allies who could not help it in time. France was a completely different situation, or at least so the Allies believed. After the fall of Poland, there followed 8 months of strange inactivity that journalists called the phony war, or in German, the Blitzkrieg, the sitting war. French and British troops deployed along the border with Germany, but no significant combat occurred. Both sides seemed to be waiting for the other to make the first move. Why didn't the Allies attack while the bulk of the German army was occupied in Poland? This question has tormented historians for decades. The answer is complex and reveals much about the mentality of the Allied leaders. In the first place, the French were simply not prepared for an offensive. Their army was organized for defense, not for attack. The doctrine of the methodical battle required careful preparation before any offensive operation, and that preparation would take time. Furthermore, the Maginot Line, although defensively formidable, was not designed to serve as a base for offensive operations. Secondly, the Allies had planned for a long war. They believed that time was on their side. The British naval blockade would eventually strangle the German economy. The industrial production of France, Great Britain, and their empires exceeded that of Germany. If the war was prolonged, the Allies would win by simple exhaustion, just as had happened in the First World War. Thirdly, there was the hope that the war could end without major battles. Perhaps the Nazi regime would collapse under the pressure of the blockade. Perhaps internal divisions would arise in Germany. Perhaps a peace could be negotiated that would avoid the bloodbath of another world war. These hopes would prove illusory, but in the autumn and winter of 1939, they did not seem irrational. The Allies did not know that Hitler was already planning his next blow. While the armies faced each other in a tense wait along the Rhine, Adolf Hitler pressured his generals to prepare an offensive against France. The Führer wanted to attack as soon as possible, ideally in November of 1939, before the Allies had time to strengthen themselves. But the German generals resisted. Many of them remembered the First World War and feared that an attack against France would end in the same bloody stalemate that had bled Germany dry between 1914 and 1918. The German army, although victorious in Poland, had suffered significant losses and needed time to recover. And the plan of attack that the High Command had developed was not particularly imaginative. This original plan, known as Full Gelb, Case Yellow, was essentially a repetition of the Schlieffen Plan of 1914. The German forces would advance through Belgium and the Netherlands, turning south to envelop the French army. It was the movement that the French expected, and for which they had prepared their response. The Allies had developed Plan D, which contemplated the advance of their best units into Belgium to confront the Germans as far east as possible. The idea was that the French and British armies would deploy along the Dill River, forming a defensive line that would connect with the Belgian and Dutch positions. If the Germans attacked through Belgium, as expected, they would be stopped by this combined line. There was a tragic irony in this situation. Both sides were planning for what the other expected. If the Germans had executed the original Fall Gelb, they would have met exactly the defence that the Allies had prepared. The result could have been a repetition of the First World War, months or years of combat in Belgium, with enormous losses on both sides. But an accident changed everything. The 10th of January of 1940, a German airplane carrying documents related to Fall Gelb got lost in a storm and landed by mistake in Belgian territory. The officer on board tried to burn the documents, but was captured before he could destroy them completely. The Belgians shared the captured plans with the Allies. How much did these documents reveal? Historians still debate this point. Some argue that the captured plans contained enough information to compromise the entire operation. Others suggest that the documents were incomplete and that the Allies did not give them the importance they deserved. In any case, the incident convinced Hitler that he needed a completely new plan. And here enters the scene one of the most controversial characters of the war, Erich von Manstein. Manstein was the Chief of Staff of Army Group A, the formation that would be deployed in the southern sector of the Western Front. Unlike many of his colleagues, Manstein believed that the original Fall Gelb was fundamentally flawed, not because the Germans could not conquer Belgium, but because doing so would not produce a decisive victory. The Allies would simply retreat, establish new defensive lines, and the war would stagnate. Manstein proposed something radically different. Instead of making the main effort through Belgium, he suggested concentrating the German armoured forces for a strike through the Ardennes. This sector, which the French considered impassable for mechanised formations, was relatively lightly defended. If the Germans could traverse the Ardennes rapidly, cross the Meuse River, and advance towards the coast of the English Channel, they would cut the lines of communication of the Allied armies in Belgium. It was an audacious, perhaps reckless plan. The roads through the Ardennes were narrow and winding. The armoured columns would be extremely vulnerable to aerial attacks while traversing the forest. And if the French reacted rapidly, they could trap the Germans with their extended supply lines and destroy them. But Manstein argued that these same characteristics that made the plan dangerous also made it potentially decisive. Precisely because the Allies did not expect an attack through the Ardennes, they would not be prepared to stop it. The surprise would compensate for the risk. Manstein's plan was initially rejected by the German High Command. His superiors considered it too risky, too dependent on everything going perfectly. Furthermore, Manstein had an abrasive personality that had earned him enemies among the military leadership. His proposals were shelved, and he was transferred to a command of lesser importance, apparently to get him out of the way. But Manstein did not give up. He managed to obtain a private audience with Hitler the 17th of February of 1940. During this meeting, he presented his plan directly to the Führer, who was fascinated. Hitler, with his gambler's instinct, was attracted by the audacity of the proposal. He ordered that Manstein's plan be developed in detail as the basis for the offensive. The German High Command, although suspicious, obeyed. The new plan kept the name Fall Gelb, but its nature had changed completely. The attack through Belgium and the Netherlands would continue, but now it would be a distraction, designed to attract the best Allied units toward the north. The main blow would come through the Ardennes, executed by Army Group A with 7 panzer divisions, concentrated on a narrow front. The responsibility of leading the armoured spearhead fell to Heinz Guderian, the apostle of mechanised warfare. Guderian would command the 19th Panzer Corps, which would include 3 armoured divisions. His mission was to traverse the Ardennes, cross the Meuse at Sedan, and advance westward as rapidly as possible, without stopping to consolidate positions or wait for the infantry. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." That way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help the engagement of the video. Alright. Also, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell and leave your like so that YouTube continues recommending our videos to you. Guderian embraced this mission with enthusiasm. It was exactly the type of operation he had advocated for years, but even he had doubts about whether it could be achieved. The Ardennes were a formidable obstacle, and the Meuse was a wide river that would have to be crossed under enemy fire. Everything would depend on speed, surprise, and, as Guderian would later admit, a considerable amount of luck. What were the Allies doing while the Germans perfected their plan of attack? The answer is disheartening. Despite the warnings and the indications, the Allied commanders persisted in their assumptions about where the attack would come from and how it should be confronted. General Maurice Gamelin, Supreme Commander of the French forces, was a 67-year-old veteran whose military career dated back to before the First World War. Gamelin was an intelligent and cultured officer, but also cautious to the point of paralysis. His headquarters was located in the Château de Vincennes, on the outskirts of Paris, a medieval building without adequate modern communications. Orders took hours to reach frontline units, and Gamelin had little real-time information about what was happening at the front. Gamelin trusted fully in Plan D and the Maginot Line. He believed that the Germans would attack through Belgium, exactly as they had done in 1914, and that the Allies would be prepared to stop them. As for the Ardennes, he shared the general opinion that they were impenetrable. The units deployed in that sector were second-rate, older reservists, and divisions with outdated equipment. There were also coordination problems among the Allies. The Belgians, although they had received intelligence about the German plans, refused to coordinate openly with France and Great Britain out of fear of provoking Germany. They maintained a policy of strict neutrality that prevented them from planning jointly with the Allies until the invasion actually began. This meant that the Allied forces would have to improvise their deployment into Belgium once the attack commenced. The British, for their part, had sent the British Expeditionary Force, BEF for its acronym in English, to France under the command of General Lord Gort. The BEF was a well-trained professional army, but relatively small. Some 390,000 troops organised into 10 divisions. The British depended on the French for strategic direction and the majority of logistical support. Allied intelligence had received multiple warnings that the Germans were planning something unusual. Agents and defectors had provided fragmentary information about troop concentrations near the Ardennes. French intelligence services had correctly identified several of the German panzer divisions, but these warnings were dismissed or ignored. Why? Part of the problem was information overload. The intelligence services constantly received contradictory reports, and it was difficult to separate genuine information from rumours and disinformation. But the deeper problem was cognitive. The Allied commanders simply could not believe that the Germans would attempt something as risky as a massive attack through the Ardennes. Their own assumptions about what was possible prevented them from seeing what was in front of them. The 10th of May of 1940, at 5:35 in the morning, the wait ended. The German forces launched their offensive in the west. The first attacks were exactly where the Allies expected. German paratroopers descended on strategic points in Belgium and the Netherlands. The Luftwaffe bombed airfields and communication nodes. Armoured columns crossed the borders of both neutral countries. In Belgium, the most audacious blow was the assault on the fort of Eben-Emael. This fortress, considered the most modern in Europe, dominated the crossing of the Albert Canal and the bridges over the Meuse. It was garrisoned by more than 1,200 soldiers and was believed impregnable. The Allied planners had assumed that Eben-Emael would hold out for days, giving time for the Allied forces to deploy. But the Germans had other plans. In the early hours of the 10th of May, 9 silent gliders landed directly on the surface of the fort, each one loaded with a small team of assault engineers. These 78 elite soldiers, armed with hollow explosive charges designed specifically to penetrate the armoured cupolas of the fort, neutralised the defensive positions one by one. The Belgian garrison, trapped inside the fort while the Germans controlled the surface, was effectively neutralised. The fort, which was supposed to resist for weeks, fell in less than 24 hours. The bridges over the Albert Canal were captured intact. The fall of Eben Emael was a tremendous psychological blow. If the most powerful fortress in Belgium could fall so quickly, what hope was there for the rest of the country? Meanwhile, the Netherlands faced its own ordeal. German paratroopers had landed near The Hague, with the mission of capturing Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch government. This audacious plan failed when the Dutch forces managed to contain the paratroopers, but the combat caused chaos throughout the country. Rotterdam was subjected to a devastating bombardment on the 14th of May that killed hundreds of civilians and destroyed the centre of the city. The Dutch surrendered that same day. General Gamelin, receiving the reports of the attack, believed that his predictions had been confirmed. The Germans were attacking through Belgium, exactly as expected. He ordered the execution of Plan D, sending his best units to the north to meet the Germans. The French First Army, the Seventh Army, and the British Expeditionary Force began their advance toward Belgium. These formations included the best mechanised and armoured divisions that the Allies had available. While they marched toward the north, moving away from the Ardennes, they were falling exactly into the trap that Manstein had designed. Because while the eyes of the world were fixed on Belgium and the Netherlands, something very different was happening further south. In the Ardennes, a traffic jam of epic proportions was developing. More than 41,000 German vehicles, including 1,222 tanks, advanced along roads designed for carts and automobiles, not for armoured columns. The bottleneck extended for more than 250 kilometres into the interior of Germany. For any aerial observer, it would have been a perfect opportunity for an attack. The German columns, stuck on narrow roads, without space to manoeuvre, would have been ideal targets for bombers. A massive aerial attack could have destroyed the German spearhead before it reached the Meuse. But that attack never came. Allied aviation was busy in other places, responding to threats in Belgium and the Netherlands. Reconnaissance planes that flew over the Ardennes reported troop movements, but the importance of these reports was not understood. The French commanders, still convinced that the Ardennes were impassable, assumed that any German force in the region would be small and of little importance. This was the first great stroke of luck for the Germans. If the Allies had attacked the stalled columns in the Ardennes during the first 2 days of the offensive, history could have been very different. But they did not, and Guderian's forces continued their tortuous advance toward the Meuse. The 12th of May, the advanced German units reached the banks of the river. The 13th of May would be the decisive day. Sedan. The name evoked painful memories for France. Here, in 1870, the French army had suffered a catastrophic defeat against the Prussians. Emperor Napoleon III had been captured, and France had lost Alsace and Lorraine. Now, 70 years later, Sedan would once again be the scene of a French defeat. The French defences at Sedan were in the hands of the 55th Infantry Division, a unit of Category B reservists. These soldiers, many of them in their 30s and 40s, were worse equipped and trained than the frontline units that were now marching toward Belgium. The division had arrived in the sector only recently, and it had not had time to fully familiarise itself with its positions. Guderian's plan to cross the Meuse was audacious and unorthodox. Instead of waiting for heavy artillery to arrive to prepare the assault, as conventional doctrine dictated, he would use the Luftwaffe as a substitute. Waves of Stuka dive bombers, would attack the French positions continuously for hours, suppressing the defences and demoralising the defenders. At 7 in the morning of the 13th of May, the first Stukas appeared over Sedan. During the next 8 hours, more than 1,500 German airplanes bombed and strafed the French positions in the most intense aerial bombardment that the world had seen until then. The sound of the Stuka sirens, designed specifically to terrify those who heard them, filled the air. The effect on the French defenders was devastating. It was not just the physical damage, although many positions were destroyed. It was the psychological effect of being under constant attack without being able to respond. The French soldiers huddled in their trenches and bunkers, unable to poke their heads out, while bombs fell around them hour after hour. At 4 in the afternoon, the German infantry began to cross the river in rubber boats. The French defences, stunned by the bombardment, offered uneven resistance. In some sectors, the soldiers fought bravely. In others, entire units abandoned their positions and fled. Guderian, observing the crossing from a nearby hill, was increasingly frustrated. The progress was slower than he had hoped, and he feared that the French would have time to organise a counterattack. But then, late in the afternoon, came the news he had been waiting for. The first pontoon bridge over the Meuse was finished. The tanks could cross. The breach was open. What were the French commanders doing while all this was happening? The answer is depressing. General André Corap, commander of the 9th Army that covered the sector from Sedan to Dinant, did not understand the gravity of the situation. The reports arriving at his headquarters were fragmentary and contradictory. Communications with frontline units had been cut by aerial attacks. Further up the chain of command, General Gamelin remained convinced that the main attack would come through Belgium. The news of the Meuse crossings was concerning, but Gamelin believed that the Germans were conducting a secondary attack intended to fix the French reserves. He hoped that his local commanders could contain the penetration, while the decisive confrontation unfolded further north. This was the second great advantage of the Germans, the inability of the French command to recognise what was happening and respond accordingly. When they finally understood that the main attack was coming through the Ardennes, it was already too late. But even in this moment of triumph, the German success hung by a thread. The 14th of May, the day after the crossing at Sedan, the French organised a counterattack. Tank and bomber units were sent to eliminate the German bridgehead. If this counterattack had been well coordinated and executed with sufficient force, it could have been decisive. The German forces on the western bank of the Meuse were still vulnerable, and the destruction of the pontoon bridge would have trapped the tanks that had already crossed. But the counterattack was a disaster. The French tank columns were sent into battle in small groups, without adequate coordination or aerial support. The French and British bombers that attacked the bridges were decimated by German anti-aircraft defence and Luftwaffe fighters. In a single day, Allied aviation lost more than 150 airplanes, attempting to destroy the Meuse crossings. The counterattack failed, and with it vanished the last opportunity to stop the German offensive in its initial phase. Guderian, now with his 3 panzer divisions west of the Meuse, was impatient to advance. His orders were to expand the bridgehead and wait for the infantry to catch up before continuing. But Guderian believed that waiting would be fatal. The French would have time to organise a defence in depth. The opportunity would be lost. In a scene that would be repeated several times during the campaign, Guderian disobeyed his orders. Instead of consolidating the bridgehead, he ordered his tanks to advance westward as rapidly as possible. "Do not look back," he instructed his commanders. "Only forward." This decision was possibly the most risky moment of the entire campaign. Guderian's divisions were advancing with their flanks completely exposed. If the French managed to cut their supply line, the German forces would be trapped without fuel or munitions. It was exactly the type of situation that war manuals warned should be avoided. But Guderian bet that the French would not react in time, and he was right. On the 15th and 16th of May, the German panzer divisions advanced more than 80 kilometers to the west, a rate of advance unprecedented in modern warfare. French towns and cities fell before anyone knew the Germans were approaching. French units, attempting to establish defensive lines, discovered that the German tanks were already behind them. Panic began to spread. Civilian refugees crowded the roads, mixing with military units trying to retreat. German airplanes strafed the columns of refugees. Adding to the chaos and desperation, communications collapsed. Nobody knew what was happening or what they should do. In Paris, the magnitude of the disaster began to be understood. The 15th of May, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud telephoned to Winston Churchill, who had just assumed the post of British Prime Minister 5 days earlier. "We have been defeated," said Reynaud. "We have lost the battle." Churchill could not believe it. So soon? Is it possible? It was possible, and it was happening. The 16th of May, Churchill flew to Paris to meet with the French leaders. What he found horrified him. Officials were burning documents in the garden of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. General Gamelin, when Churchill asked him where the strategic reserve was, responded with a single word: "Aucune." None. There was no reserve. All the best French units were in Belgium, increasingly isolated as the Germans advanced toward the English Channel, and nobody seemed to know how to stop the advance. But in this moment of apparent triumph, a crisis arose on the German side that almost stopped the offensive. Guderian's superior commanders, terrified by the speed of the advance and worried about the exposed flanks, ordered a pause. General Ewald von Kleist, the commander of the Panzer Group, of which Guderian's corps was a part, flew to Guderian's headquarters to order him personally to stop. What followed was one of the most extraordinary confrontations of the war. Guderian, furious, offered his resignation. He argued that stopping the advance would be a catastrophic error that would give time for the Allies to recover. Von Kleist rejected the resignation but insisted on the whole order. Finally, a compromise was reached. Guderian could continue reconnaissances in force, which were essentially offensive advances under another name. It was a legal fiction that allowed Guderian to keep advancing while technically obeying the orders to halt. This crisis revealed the deep divisions within the German High Command about how the campaign should be conducted. Many generals, including Hitler himself, feared that the advance was too fast, that the tanks were moving dangerously far away from the infantry. If the French achieved a successful counterattack, the entire operation could turn into a disaster. These fears were not irrational. The German flanks were genuinely exposed. The panzer divisions were consuming fuel and munitions faster than they could be resupplied. And the French still had considerable forces that could have been employed in a decisive counterattack. But that counterattack never came. Why? Part of the answer has to do with the collapse of the French command system. General Gamelin was relieved of his post the 19th of May and replaced by General Maxime Weygand, a 73-year-old officer who had been Ferdinand Foch's assistant during the First World War. But the change of command in the middle of a battle only added confusion. Weygand needed several days to familiarize himself with the situation, time that the French did not have. Weygand proposed an ambitious plan for a coordinated counterattack. The Allied armies in the north would attack southward, while the French forces in the south would attack northward. If both attacks succeeded, they could cut the German corridor and reconnect their Allied forces. The plan was strategically sound, but it arrived too late. The Allied forces in the north were too disorganized and exhausted to mount an effective attack. The forces in the south did not have the necessary resources. The counterattack attempts that were made, like the one at Arras the 21st of May, were too small to be decisive. The counterattack at Arras deserves special attention because it shows what could have been. The 21st of May, 2 battalions of British tanks, supported by infantry, attacked the southern flank of the German corridor near the city of Arras. Although the attacking force was small, less than 100 tanks, it achieved a surprising success. The British tanks penetrated several miles into the German lines, sowing panic among the support units. General Erwin Rommel, then commander of the 7th Panzer Division, had to intervene personally to organize the defense. The Germans suffered significant losses, and for a moment, it seemed that the entire advance could be in danger. But the counterattack was too small and was not followed up. The British, unable to maintain the momentum without reinforcements, retreated. Rommel later enormously exaggerated the size of the attacking force, reporting that he had been attacked by hundreds of tanks. This exaggeration contributed to the growing nervousness of the German High Command about the exposed flanks. Meanwhile, the Allied forces in Belgium found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. The German advance towards the English Channel had cut their lines of communication with France. The French First Army, the British Expeditionary Force, and the Belgian Army were being pushed into an ever smaller perimeter around the port of Dunkirk. The 20th of May, the German tanks reached the coast of the English Channel near Abbeville. The corridor was complete. The Allied armies in the north were isolated. Now began the race toward Dunkirk. The German plan was simple: continue the advance toward the north along the coast, capture the Channel ports, and destroy or capture the trapped Allied armies. With the combined British, French, and Belgian forces eliminated, nothing would stand between the Germans and the complete conquest of France. But then something happened that has baffled historians for decades. The 24th of May, Hitler ordered the panzer divisions to halt. Hitler's famous halt order remains one of the most controversial moments of the war. Why did Hitler stop his tanks when victory seemed within reach? The explanations proposed are numerous, and none is completely satisfactory. One theory suggests that Hitler wanted to preserve his armoured forces for the following phase of the campaign, the conquest of the rest of France. The tanks had been in continuous combat for 2 weeks, and many needed maintenance. Losing them in a final battle against the trapped Allies could weaken the German capacity to complete the victory. Another theory points to the recommendations of the field commanders. General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, had expressed concern about the wear and tear of the armoured forces and had suggested a pause to allow the infantry to catch up. Hitler, sharing these concerns, converted the suggestion into an order. A third theory, more controversial, suggests that Hitler deliberately allowed the British to escape as a gesture toward a future of peace. The Führer, according to this interpretation, still hoped to reach an agreement with Great Britain and did not want to completely humiliate her by destroying her army. This theory has little support among serious historians, but it has persisted in popular imagination. The most probable explanation is a combination of factors. The terrain around Dunkirk, with its canals and swampy lands, was not ideal for armoured operations. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had promised that his air force could destroy the trapped Allies without needing to risk the precious tanks. And the German High Command, still nervous about the exposed flanks, saw the pause as an opportunity to consolidate their positions before the final assault. Whatever the reason, the halt order gave the Allies a desperately needed respite, and the British took maximum advantage of it. What would you have done in that situation? Hundreds of thousands of soldiers trapped on a beach, with the enemy closing in from all sides, with airplanes bombing constantly, with insufficient ships to evacuate everyone. The British response to this crisis would become one of the most extraordinary operations of the war. Operation Dynamo, as the evacuation of Dunkirk was called, began the 26th of May of 1940. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, responsible for the operation, initially hoped to be able to evacuate some 45,000 soldiers before the perimeter collapsed. What followed surpassed all expectations. In addition to the destroyers and transports of the Royal Navy, hundreds of civilian vessels crossed the English Channel to participate in the evacuation. Pleasure yachts, fishing boats, ferries, tugboats, even lifeboats. Anything that could float and cross the channel was requisitioned or offered voluntarily. This fleet of little ships became a symbol of British determination not to abandon their soldiers. The conditions on the beaches were infernal, The soldiers waited for hours, sometimes days, forming long lines that went into the water. Luftwaffe Stukas attacked constantly, although the Royal Air Force fought fiercely to provide aerial cover. The bombs raised columns of sand and water. Corpses floated in the waves. But the evacuation continued. Day after day, night after night, the ships came and went. The 27th of May, 7,669 soldiers were evacuated. The 28th, almost 18,000. The 29th, more than 47,000. The 30th of May, the figure reached 53,823. How was it possible? How did they manage to evacuate so many when the conditions seemed impossible? Part of the answer was desperate improvisation. The soldiers constructed improvised piers, with trucks sunk in the sand. The small ships, with shallow drafts that allowed them to approach the beach, transported soldiers to the larger ships anchored further away. The captains of the destroyers, risking their ships in dangerously shallow waters, loaded thousands of soldiers on every trip. Another part of the answer was sacrifice. Many ships were sunk by bombs or torpedoes. Entire crews perished. But other ships took their places. The determination not to abandon the trapped army overcame the fear of death. The 1st of June, more than 64,000 soldiers were evacuated, the most successful day of the whole operation. By then, the greater part of the British Expeditionary Force had escaped. But there still remained tens of thousands of French soldiers defending the perimeter. Churchill insisted that the French must be evacuated together with the British. Arm in arm, he declared. During the final days of the operation, the proportion of French evacuees increased significantly, but time was running out. The 4th of June, at 3:40 in the morning, the last British ship departed from Dunkirk. The operation had ended. The Germans entered the city that same morning, capturing the 40,000 French soldiers who remained defending the perimeter until the end. The final numbers of Operation Dynamo astounded the world. In 9 days, 338,226 soldiers had been evacuated, including 139,997 French. It was much more than anyone had believed possible. But Dunkirk was also a defeat. The British Army had escaped, but it had left behind practically all its heavy equipment. More than 68,000 vehicles, including tanks and armoured vehicles, were abandoned. Almost 2,500 cannons remained on the beaches. Enormous quantities of munitions, supplies and equipment fell into German hands. Winston Churchill, in his famous speech before the House of Commons the 4th of June, warned against triumphalism. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory, he declared. Wars are not won with evacuations. But Churchill also pronounced words that would resonate through history. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Great Britain would continue fighting, but France was about to fall. What happened to the French army after Dunkirk? This is a question that many forget to ask, but the answer is crucial to understanding the final collapse of France. When the evacuation of Dunkirk began, France still disposed of considerable forces south of the German corridor. 60 French divisions, although many were incomplete or of the second line, were deployed along a line that extended from the English Channel to the Swiss border. General Weygand planned a defence in depth along the rivers Somme and Aisne, hoping to stop the Germans or at least delay their advance enough for reinforcements to arrive. But the Germans gave no truce. The 5th of June, barely a day after the evacuation of Dunkirk ended, they launched the second phase of their offensive, Full Rot, Case Red. The battle for France proper had begun. The German forces for Full Rot were formidable. 143 divisions, including 10 panzer divisions, hurled themselves against the French lines. The Luftwaffe, with almost total mastery of the air after the losses suffered by Allied aviation in previous weeks, provided devastating close support. The French fought with more determination than is often recognized. At various points of the line, the defenses held for days against repeated attacks. The French resistance at Abbeville, at the mouth of the Somme, was particularly fierce. The Germans suffered significant losses, attempting to break the French positions. But German superiority was overwhelming. Where the French defences held out, the Germans simply bypassed them, utilising the same tactic of deep penetration that had worked so well in the Ardennes. The panzer divisions found weak points, exploited them and advanced into the French rear, creating chaos and confusion. The 9th of June, the Germans crossed the Somme at various points. The 10th of June, Italy declared war on France and Great Britain, opening a new front in the Alps. Mussolini, seeing that France was about to fall, wanted to participate in the spoils. "I only need a few thousand dead to sit at the peace table," he commented cynically. The 12th of June, Paris was declared an open city to avoid its destruction. The French government fled first to Tours and then to Bordeaux. The Germans entered the French capital the 14th of June, parading down the Champs-Élysées before a stunned and humiliated population. Can you imagine that moment? The city that had been the cultural centre of Europe, the capital that had resisted the Prussian siege in 1871, the metropolis that had been the heart of the civilized world, now occupied by the forces of Adolf Hitler. German soldiers posing for photographs in front of the Eiffel Tower, flags with the swastika waving over the Arc de Triomphe. For the French, who witnessed those days, the shock was almost incomprehensible. How had this happened? How had the great France fallen in barely 6 weeks? The French government was divided on what to do. Some, like the Under-Secretary of War, Charles de Gaulle, advocated continuing the fight from the French colonies in North Africa. France still controlled a powerful navy and a vast colonial empire. The war could continue even if the metropolis was occupied. But others, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, the old man who had been called upon to save France, believed that the situation was irreparable. Continuing the fight would only prolong the suffering without changing the final outcome. France had to seek an armistice. The 17th of June, Pétain, who had assumed the post of Prime Minister the day before, announced by radio that France would seek peace. "With a heavy heart, I tell you today that we must cease hostilities," he declared. De Gaulle, who had flown to London, responded the next day with his own radio broadcast. "France has lost a battle," he proclaimed, "but France has not lost the war." He called upon the French to continue the resistance, to join him in exile. But few heard his message, and even fewer answered his call. At that moment, de Gaulle was an almost unknown brigadier general, while Pétain was the saviour of Verdun, the most respected military man in France. The armistice was signed the 22nd of June of 1940 in the exact same train carriage in Compiègne, where Germany had signed the armistice of 1918. Hitler had specifically ordered that the ceremony be held there, in the same place, to erase the humiliation of the German defeat in the First World War. The terms of the armistice were harsh. The north and west of France, including Paris and the entire Atlantic coast, would be occupied by Germany. The French government would retain nominal control of the south and southeast, but had to collaborate with the occupation authorities. The French army would be disarmed. France had to pay the costs of the German occupation. French prisoners of war, almost 1,800,000 soldiers, would remain in captivity until a definitive peace treaty was signed. The French Third Republic had come to an end. In its place arose the French state, headquartered in the spa town of Vichy, under the leadership of Marshal Pétain. The Vichy regime would collaborate with Nazi Germany during the next 4 years, a collaboration that would include the deportation of French Jews to extermination camps. The fall of France was complete. But now we must return to the question we posed at the beginning of this account. Was the Blitzkrieg pure luck, or was there something else behind the unexpected collapse of France? The answer, as often happens in history, is complex. The The German success was neither pure genius nor pure luck, but a combination of factors that aligned themselves in an extraordinary manner. Let us begin with what the Germans did right. Manstein's plan, with its emphasis on the strike through the Ardennes, was genuinely brilliant. By concentrating armoured forces at the least expected point, the Germans achieved a strategic surprise that the Allies could not overcome. The decision to make the main effort through the Ardennes instead of Belgium transformed a potential war of attrition into a decisive victory. Tactical execution was also excellent. German commanders, especially Guderian and Rommel, demonstrated an aggressiveness and initiative that their opponents could not match. When opportunities presented themselves, they exploited them immediately, without waiting for orders from their superiors. This decentralization of command, which the Germans called Auftragstaktik, or mission tactics, allowed field commanders to make rapid decisions adapted to local circumstances. Coordination between the different arms of the German army was also superior. Tanks, motorized infantry, artillery and aviation worked together in ways that Allies could not replicate. The Luftwaffe, in particular, functioned as an extension of the ground army, providing close support that compensated for the lack of heavy artillery in the advanced armoured divisions. But were these advantages sufficient to explain the magnitude of the victory? Many historians argue no. Allied weaknesses were equally important, if not more so. French military doctrine, with its emphasis on the methodical battle and defence, was fundamentally inadequate to face the war of movement that the Germans were waging. French commanders, trained in the lessons of the First World War, could not adapt to a battlefield that changed by hours instead of weeks. The French command system was rigid and slow. Orders passed through multiple levels of hierarchy, each of which added delays. When they finally reached frontline units, they were often already obsolete. General Gamelin, isolated in his headquarters without modern communications, had little idea of what was happening on the battlefield. Allied intelligence failed on multiple levels. Despite warnings about German concentration in the Ardennes, Allied commanders refused to believe that the Germans would attempt something so risky. Their own assumptions about what was possible blinded them to what was actually happening. And then there is the luck factor. The Germans had extraordinary luck at several critical moments of the campaign. The fact that their allies did not attack the stalled columns in the Ardennes during the first days was an almost miraculous fortune. The collapse of French morale at Sedan, which allowed a faster crossing than expected, was another stroke of luck. Hitler's decision to stop the tanks before Dunkirk, which could have been a disaster if the Allies had counterattacked, turned out not to matter because the Allies were too disorganized to exploit it. What would have happened if any of these factors had been different? If the Allies had bombed the Ardennes? If the French defence at Sedan had been more tenacious? If the Allied counterattacks had been better coordinated? It is impossible to know for sure, but many historians believe that the campaign could have ended very differently. The German army, despite its victories, was operating at the limit of its capabilities. Its supply lines were dangerously extended. Its tanks were worn out by weeks of continuous combat. A well-executed Allied counterattack could have turned the German victory into a catastrophe. Hitler himself later acknowledged how risky the operation had been. In a private conversation, he admitted that he had had beginner's luck in France. German generals, in their post-war memoirs, also emphasized the moments when the campaign came close to failing. But luck by itself does not explain everything. For luck to matter, the Germans first had to put themselves in a position to exploit it. Manstein's plan, Guderian's aggressiveness, the coordination of German forces, all this created the conditions in which luck could make a difference. The Allies, with their defensive doctrine and their rigid command system, were not in a position to exploit their own opportunities. Perhaps the best way to understand the campaign of France is as a perfect storm of factors that combined to produce a result that nobody had foreseen. Neither the Germans expected such a complete victory, nor the Allies anticipated such a catastrophic defeat. The result surprised everyone. What lessons can we extract from this history? The first is the importance of doctrinal flexibility. The French lost not because they lacked resources, but because their ideas about how war should be fought were inadequate for the circumstances. The army that prepares only for the last war is condemned to lose the next one. The second is the value of decentralized initiative. German commanders, empowered to make rapid decisions without waiting for orders from above, could exploit opportunities that their opponents could not match. On a rapidly changing battlefield, the speed of decision-making can be as important as brute force. The third is the danger of unexamined assumptions. The French assumed that the Ardennes were impassable. The Germans demonstrated that they were wrong. Beliefs that are not questioned can become fatal blind spots. And the fourth, perhaps the most unsettling, is the role of chance in history. Great historical events often depend on contingencies that could have been different. An airplane that does not get lost, a counterattack that is executed properly, an order that is not given, small changes that could have produced completely different outcomes. The fall of France in 1940 changed the course of the Second World War, and by extension, the entire history of the 20th century. If France had held out, if the war had stagnated in the West, as it had done 25 years earlier, the world we know today would be unrecognizably different. But history does not allow second chances. What happened, happened. And the consequences of those 6 weeks of May and June of 1940 reverberated for decades. Now, let us delve into some of the lesser-known aspects of this campaign, details that are rarely mentioned in conventional histories, but that reveal the true complexity of what occurred. Did you know that the French army had more tanks than the German at the start of the campaign? This is one of the most surprising ironies of the fall of France. The French possessed approximately 3,500 tanks, while the Germans had around 2,440. Furthermore, many of the French tanks were technically superior to their German counterparts. The Char B1, the French heavy tank, had thicker armour and a more powerful gun than any German tank of the era. In individual combat, French tanks often defeated the Germans. Then why did they lose? The answer has to do with how the tanks were used, not how many there were. The French dispersed their armoured forces along the front, assigning tanks to infantry divisions to provide support. The Germans concentrated theirs in dedicated panzer divisions that could operate independently and concentrate combat power at decisive points. It is like the difference between sprinkling salt evenly over a plate and concentrating it in a specific spot. The same amount of salt, but completely different effects. Moreover, French tanks suffered from design problems that limited their effectiveness. Many had crews of only 1 or 2 people, which meant that the commander also had to operate the gun, load it, and sometimes even drive. German tanks, although technically inferior in some respects, had larger crews with specialized roles, making them more efficient in combat. Communications were also a critical problem. The majority of French tanks lacked radios, depending on flags and signals to communicate. German tanks were equipped with radios that allowed commanders to coordinate their actions in real time. In the confusion of the battlefield, this advantage in communications was often decisive. Another little-known aspect of the campaign is the role of aviation. The German Luftwaffe has received much credit for its role in the victory, and rightly so. But the complete history is more nuanced than what is generally presented. At the beginning of the campaign, the Allies possessed considerable air forces. The French Armée de l'Air had approximately 1,400 combat aircraft, to which were added the Royal Air Force squadrons deployed in France. In total, the Allies had an air force comparable in size to the Luftwaffe. But there were important qualitative differences. Many of the French airplanes were obsolete models, incapable of facing the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. French pilots, although brave, often lacked the training and experience of their German opponents, many of whom had fought in the Spanish Civil War. Even more important was the doctrine of employment. The Luftwaffe was organized to provide close support to the army, with Stuka dive bombers acting almost like flying artillery. Allied aviation, by contrast, was oriented toward independent strategic operations and the air defense of the national territory. When aerial support was needed for ground troops, the system to request and coordinate it was slow and cumbersome. The result was that the Luftwaffe dominated the skies over the battlefield, not necessarily because it had more planes, but because it utilized them more effectively. Allied soldiers, constantly under aerial attack while promised cover never arrived, developed a sort of Stuka psychosis that undermined morale even when actual physical damage was limited. Allied aerial losses during the campaign were devastating. The French Air Force lost more than 900 airplanes. The RAF lost more than 450, including almost all the Hurricane fighters sent to France. These losses left both countries in a weakened position to face the next phase of the war. And what about the famous Maginot Line? Did it really fail? Here we encounter another myth that deserves to be examined. The Maginot Line was not defeated, it was bypassed. The fortifications fulfilled their purpose of making a frontal attack across the Franco-German border impracticable. The Germans did not even attempt a direct assault against the main works of the line. The problem was that the line did not cover the entire border. It ended in the Ardennes, exactly where the Germans chose to attack. And this gap was not an accident or an oversight, but a deliberate decision based on assumptions that proved to be incorrect. The defenders of the Maginot Line had argued that the fortifications would free up troops to deploy elsewhere, and in a certain sense, they were right. The garrisons of the line were relatively small compared to the forces that would have been necessary to defend the same border without fortifications. The problem was that the freed up troops were sent in the wrong direction, toward Belgium, leaving the Ardennes weakly defended. After the war, the Maginot Line became synonymous with preparing for the wrong war, with strategic inflexibility, with over-reliance on static defences. But this reputation is partially unfair. The line did what it was designed to do. The failure belonged to the commanders, who did not anticipate where the real attack would come from. Let us now delve into the individual experiences of those who lived those days, because behind the statistics and the movements of armies, there were real people whose lives were transformed by these events. Imagine being a French soldier at Sedan the 13th of May of 1940. You have been in your position for months, waiting for an attack that never seemed to arrive. The phony war has lulled you into a false sense of security, and then suddenly the sky fills with airplanes. The testimonies of survivors describe the bombardment as an almost supernatural experience. The constant roar of the engines, the whistle of falling bombs, the explosions that shook the earth and made eardrums bleed, and above all, the scream of the Stuka sirens, a sound designed specifically to terrify, a mechanical howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A French soldier later wrote, "It was not the fear of dying that was the worst. It was the feeling of complete impotence. We could not respond. We could not escape. We could only wait and pray that the next bomb would not fall in our trench." Hour after hour, the bombardment continued. 8 hours of almost uninterrupted attacks. By the time it ended, many soldiers were in a state of shock, incapable of functioning effectively. When the German infantry began to cross the river, it found dazed defenders, who in many cases could not offer coordinated resistance. But not all Frenchmen surrendered or fled. There were acts of extraordinary bravery that are rarely mentioned in the histories of the campaign. At the fort of La Ferté, part of the extension of the Maginot Line towards the Ardennes, a garrison of 107 soldiers held out for 3 days against continuous German attacks. The fort was finally reduced through explosive charges placed directly against the embrasures. When the Germans finally entered, they found that the entire garrison had perished at their posts. None had surrendered. In Stoen, a small village near Sedan, French and Germans fought fiercely for 4 days. The village changed hands 17 times. French Char B-1 tanks demonstrated their superiority in close combat, destroying numerous German tanks. A single Char B-1, the Ure, destroyed 13 German tanks in a single engagement, its thick armour rejecting impact after impact. But these tactical victories could not change the strategic outcome. While the French won local battles, the Germans surrounded them. Units that resisted heroically were cut off, without supplies, without reinforcements, without hope of victory. And the civilians? What became of the millions of people who lived in the combat zones? The exodus of May and June of 1940 was one of the largest population displacements in European history. Between 8 and 10 million people fled their homes, terrified by the bombings and the stories of German atrocities, many of them exaggerated or completely invented, but no less terrifying for that. The roads of France became rivers of humanity, whole families carrying what they could take, mattresses tied to the roofs of cars, carts pulled by horses full of belongings, elderly pushed in wheelbarrows, lost children crying for their parents. The heat of May and June made the journey even more miserable. Water was scarce, food was hard to find. And then the planes arrived. German pilots had orders to attack the columns of refugees. The official justification was that the refugees were congesting the roads that the French forces needed to maneuver. But the practical effect was to sow panic and demoralization among the civilian population. Survivors described nightmare scenes, the buzz of approaching airplanes, the shouts of warning, the desperate search for refuge in the ditches, while machine guns swept the road, the bodies lying on the asphalt when the planes flew away, the groans of the wounded, the crying of children. A woman who was a child during the exodus remembered decades later, "I saw my neighbour, Madame Dupont, who always gave us sweets, lying next to her cart with her Sunday dress soaked in blood. Her eyes were open, looking at the sky. I will never forget those eyes." These experiences would mark a generation of French people. The trauma of the exodus and the occupation would shape French politics and society for decades, contributing both to Vichy collaboration and to the resistance that eventually emerged against it. Let us return now to examine some of the most controversial decisions of the campaign, decisions that are still debated by historians, and that reveal how close the outcome was to being different. What would have happened if the Allies had counterattacked with more force? The Arras counterattack of the 21st of May demonstrated that the Germans were vulnerable. With barely 2 tank battalions, the British managed to sow panic in the German lines. Rommel, one of the most capable commanders of the German army, had to intervene personally to stabilise the situation. What would have occurred if the counterattack had been launched with all available force? The Allies still had armoured divisions that had not been committed. A coordinated attack from the north and the south against the German corridor could have cut the supply lines of the panzer divisions and potentially destroyed the spearhead of the entire offensive. The Weygand plan contemplated exactly this type of operation, but it was never executed effectively. Why? The reasons are multiple. Communications between the Allied armies were poor. The units were exhausted and demoralized. The commanders did not trust one another. The time needed to organize a coordinated operation simply was not available. But some historians argue that the real problem was psychological. The Allied commanders had lost the initiative and could not regain it. They were reacting to German movements instead of imposing their own. In war, as in chess, whoever loses the initiative often loses the game. Another controversial decision was the Dunkirk evacuation. Should Great Britain have committed more resources to defend the perimeter instead of evacuating it? Churchill initially favoured a prolonged defence of the Dunkirk enclave, believing that the Allies could maintain a bridgehead indefinitely, forcing the Germans to divert significant forces to contain it. This strategy would have kept British troops on the continent and potentially helped sustain French morale. But the military commanders convinced Churchill that the perimeter was unsustainable in the long term. Without adequate aerial support, without sufficient supplies, without hope of relief, the trapped forces would eventually be destroyed or captured. It was better to save the army, even if it lost its equipment, to fight another day. Was the decision correct? From the British perspective, almost certainly yes. The army evacuated from Dunkirk formed the core of the forces that would defend Great Britain during the Battle of Britain, and that would eventually return to the continent on D-Day. Without those veteran soldiers, the British position would have been much weaker. But from the French perspective, the evacuation was a betrayal. While the British escaped, the French stayed behind to continue fighting a war that was already lost. This resentment poisoned Franco-British relations for years and contributed to the Vichy government's decision to collaborate with Germany instead of continuing the fight from exile. And then there is the biggest question of all. Could France have continued the war from North Africa? When the armistice was signed, France still controlled a vast colonial empire. North Africa, French, West Africa, Indochina, numerous islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean. All this remained out of German reach. The French Navy, the fourth largest in the world, was intact. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had escaped to the colonies, or could be evacuated. A French government in exile, established in Algiers or Rabat, could have continued the war alongside Great Britain. The French colonies would have provided bases, resources, and soldiers. The French Navy would have kept the maritime routes open. France would have remained an active belligerent, instead of becoming a satellite state of Germany. Why did this not happen? The reasons are complex. Many French leaders, including Pétain, genuinely believed that Great Britain would also fall soon, and that continuing the war would be a useless sacrifice. Others feared that abandoning the metropolitan territory would mean abandoning the millions of French people who would live under German occupation. There were also internal political considerations. The more conservative elements of the French establishment saw in the defeat an opportunity to dismantle the Third Republic and create a more authoritarian regime. Charles de Gaulle, practically alone among the French leaders, advocated continuing the struggle. His call on the 18th of June became the foundational act of Free France. But at that moment, de Gaulle was a solitary voice in the desert. The French who initially followed him were counted in the hundreds, not in the thousands. The decision to seek the armistice, taken in the desperate days of June 1940, would shape the fate of France for the next 4 years. The Vichy regime, born of defeat, would collaborate with the Nazis in ways that would stain the French conscience for generations. Now let us examine the legacy of the Battle of France. How did the world change as a result of those 6 weeks? The most immediate impact was strategic. With France out of the war, Great Britain stood alone facing Nazi Germany. The island faced the real possibility of invasion, a threat that had not been serious since the Napoleonic era. The following months would see the Battle of Britain, the German attempt to achieve the aerial superiority necessary for an invasion. But the fall of France also had broader consequences. It demonstrated that the great European powers were vulnerable to a rapid and well-executed attack. This lesson was not lost on the Japanese, who observed with interest how the European colonial powers were humiliated. Less than 2 years later, Japan would launch its own lightning war against the colonial territories of Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands in Southeast Asia. The German victory also convinced many observers that Nazism was the future. In occupied and neutral countries, fascist movements gained strength. Collaborators stepped forward to work with the new masters of Europe. It seemed that the old liberal order was doomed to be replaced by a new authoritarian order. Of course, we know how the story ended. Germany would eventually be defeated, crushed between the Soviet and Western armies. The Nazi regime collapsed in the ruins of Berlin in 1945. Europe was reconstructed along democratic lines, at least in the West. But in June of 1940, none of this was evident. The future seemed to belong to the dictators, and the fall of France was the most dramatic proof that the old world was dying. What can we learn from all this? What relevance does this history have for us today? Perhaps the most important lesson is about the fragility of the institutions we take for granted. France in 1940 was an established democracy with a powerful army and loyal allies. It seemed to be one of the most secure nations in the world, and yet it collapsed in 6 weeks. The collapse was not only military, it was also political, social, and psychological. French institutions, weakened by years of internal conflict, could not withstand the pressure of an acute crisis. When the test came, the system simply crumbled. This is a warning that resonates in our own era. Democracies are not immortal. They can be destroyed, from the outside or from within. Constant vigilance is the price of liberty. Another lesson has to do with adaptability. The French lost because they could not adapt to a type of war for which they were not prepared. They had prepared meticulously for the last war, and the next war took them by surprise. This is a problem that affects all institutions, not just armies. Organizations tend to optimize themselves for the challenges of the past, not those of the future. When the environment changes, those who cannot adapt are left behind. And finally, there is the lesson about the role of chance in history. The Battle of France was full of moments where small changes could have produced very different results. An airplane that does not get lost, a counterattack that is executed better, an order that is not given. History could have taken a completely different path. This does not mean that history is simply a series of accidents, deep structures, economic forces, ideologies. All this matters. But within these structures, there is room for contingency, individual decisions, luck, timing. All this can tip the balance at critical moments. The fall of France in 1940 was one of those critical moments. The world that emerged from it was different from what would have existed if the outcome had been different. For better or worse, we live with the consequences of those 6 weeks to this day. But there is more to tell. Details that reveal the human complexity behind great historical events. Stories of individuals whose lives were transformed by the campaign and whose decisions, large and small, contributed to the final outcome. Do you know the story of Captain Pierre Bilot? Bilot commanded a Char B-1 Beast tank named Jura during the fighting at Stonne. The 17th of May of 1940, his tank was ambushed by a column of German tanks. What followed was one of the most extraordinary tank battles of the entire war. The Jura faced off alone against more than a dozen German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. The German projectiles struck the armour of the Char B-1, but could not penetrate it. Bilot, taking advantage of the superiority of his armour, systematically destroyed his opponents. When the combat ended, 13 German tanks were burning in the field. When the Jura returned to the French lines, the mechanics counted more than 140 impacts on its armour. None had penetrated. Bilot and his crew had proven that French tanks could beat the Germans in combat. But victories like Bilot's could not change the outcome of the campaign. The German tanks he destroyed were replaced. The French forces around Stonne were eventually surrounded and destroyed. Bilot himself survived the war, only to die in an automobile accident in 1947. His story illustrates both the individual bravery of many French soldiers and the futility of that bravery in the face of strategic defeat. Individual acts of heroism, however extraordinary they may be, rarely can change the course of a war. And what about the Germans? How did they experience the campaign? For many German soldiers, the campaign of France was a euphoric experience. After years of preparation, they were finally proving their worth. Victories followed one after another. The enemy fled before them. It seemed that nothing could stop them. A young tank officer wrote to his family, "It is like a dream. We advance kilometre after kilometre, and the French simply disappear. Sometimes I wonder if this is real, or if I will wake up and discover that I am still in the barracks in Germany." But there were also moments of doubt and fear. The veterans, those who had fought in the First World War, knew that war could change rapidly. They remembered how the German advance of 1914 had been stopped at the Marne. They feared that history would repeat itself. An infantry sergeant remembered later, "Every time we received orders to advance, I expected that this would be the time we would finally encounter serious resistance. Every village we passed through, I thought the next one would be where the French would wait for us. But we kept advancing, and the resistance never came. There was also a dark side to the German victory. The SS troops, the paramilitary organization of the Nazi Party, committed atrocities against prisoners of war and civilians. At Le Paradis, the 27th of May, SS soldiers executed 97 British prisoners of war who had surrendered. At Wormhout, another group of the SS massacred more than 80 British prisoners. These crimes were an omen of the much greater atrocities that would come during the occupation of Eastern Europe. The campaign of France, although relatively clean in comparison to what would follow, already showed signs of the brutality that would characterize the Nazi war. Let us examine now the role of technology in the campaign. Was German technological superiority decisive? The answer is more complicated than it might seem. As we have seen, the French had tanks that in many respects were superior to the Germans. Their artillery was comparable. Their fortifications were first class. In purely material terms, the Allies were not at a significant disadvantage. But there were areas where the Germans did have an advantage. Radio communications, already mentioned, were one of them. The integration of aviation with ground forces was another. And the Germans also had an advantage in some specific types of equipment, like the Stuka dive bombers and the 88mm anti-tank guns. The Stuka, the Junkers Ju-87, became the symbol of the Lightning War. Its distinctive inverted gull-wing profile and its howling siren made it unmistakable. Although technically it was an obsolete plane, slow and vulnerable to enemy fighters, it proved devastatingly effective when the Luftwaffe controlled the airspace. The Stuka could attack with a precision that conventional artillery could not match. Descending in an almost vertical dive onto its target, it could place bombs with remarkable exactness. For the ground troops facing Stuka attacks, the experience was terrifying. The howl of the siren, the plane plunging toward them, the explosion of the bomb that seemed to have been directed personally against them. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun, originally designed to shoot down airplanes, proved to be equally effective against tanks. Its high muzzle velocity and its flat trajectory made it ideal for firing against armoured vehicles. Allied tanks, even the heavy Char B-1S, were vulnerable to the 88 at distances where their own guns could not respond effectively. But technology alone does not explain the German victory. Tools are only as good as those who use them. And the Germans had developed doctrines and tactics that maximized their technological capabilities, while the Allies had not achieved the same. Let us consider the role of intelligence in the campaign. How did the Allied intelligence services fail so completely? The Allies did not lack information. Their intelligence services had identified many of the German units deployed for the offensive. Troop movements towards the Ardennes had been detected. Agents and defectors had provided specific warnings. The problem was not intelligence gathering, but its interpretation. Allied analysts filtered the information through their own assumptions about what the Germans could and would do. When the information contradicted those assumptions, it was discarded or reinterpreted. An illustrative case is that of the Belgian pilot who flew over the Ardennes the 10th of May and observed the enormous German columns stalled on the forest roads. He reported what he had seen, but his superiors did not believe him. It was simply impossible, according to conventional wisdom, that the Germans would attempt to pass armoured formations through the Ardennes. The report was archived. This type of intelligence failure, where correct information is available but is ignored because it contradicts established beliefs, is known as a failure of imagination. The Allied commanders simply could not imagine that the Germans would do something so risky and unorthodox as the attack through the Ardennes. Their lack of imagination blinded them to reality. The Allied intelligence failure in 1940 is still studied today in military and intelligence schools as an example of how cognitive biases can compromise even the most sophisticated organizations. It is a lesson that remains relevant in our era of information overload. What role did leadership play in the campaign? The contrast between the leaders of both sides is striking. On the German side, figures like Guderian, Rommel, and Manstein demonstrated initiative, aggressiveness, and a willingness to take calculated risks. On the Allied side, commanders like Gamelin, Georges, and Blanchard were cautious to the point of paralysis, unable to make quick decisions or adapt to changing circumstances. But it would be unfair to attribute all the responsibility to individual personalities. The systems within which these leaders operated also mattered. The German command system, with its emphasis on Auftragstaktik, encouraged field commanders to take the initiative. The French system, with its rigid hierarchical structure, discouraged it. Furthermore, leaders are formed by their experiences. The French commanders who had survived the butchery of the First World War naturally favoured cautious approaches that minimised casualties. The Germans, who had lost that war and had spent 20 years analysing what had gone wrong, were more willing to try something new. Hitler, for his part, played an ambiguous role. His insistence on launching the offensive as soon as possible, and his enthusiasm for Manstein's plan, contributed to the success. But his halt order before Dunkirk almost allowed hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers to escape, and his nervousness about the exposed flanks almost stopped the advance at several critical moments. Hitler's apologists, during and after the war, tried to attribute all the credit for the victory to him. Hitler's critics tried to attribute all the blame for the errors to him. The reality, as always, is more nuanced. Hitler made some good decisions and some bad ones. The same can be said of his generals. The victory was the result of the interaction between many people, not the creation of a single military genius. Let us reflect now on how the memory of the campaign has evolved over time. Immediately after the war, the dominant narrative was simple. The Germans had won because they were militarily superior, and the Allies had lost because they were inferior. This narrative served the interests of almost everyone. The Germans could take pride in their military achievements, even while they condemned the crimes of Nazism. The Allies could explain their defeat as the result of circumstances beyond their control. But as historians examined the events more closely, this simple narrative began to crumble. The Allies were not as inferior as had been believed. The Germans were not as superior. The campaign was full of errors on both sides, of missed opportunities, of moments when the results could have been different. But with time, a more nuanced understanding began to emerge. Historians recognized that both structural factors and contingencies had played a role. The German victory was neither inevitable nor purely accidental. It was the result of a complex interaction among preparation, execution, errors, and luck. And here we come to a question that perhaps you are asking yourself. What happened next? How did Great Britain respond to the fall of France? And what were the Germans planning to do with their victory? Because the story did not end in June of 1940. In fact, it was just beginning. The fall of France left Great Britain in a position that seemed desperate. The only major ally of the British had been eliminated in 6 weeks. The British Army, although it had escaped from Dunkirk, had lost practically all its heavy equipment, and on the other side of the English Channel, the most powerful army in the world was preparing for its next move. What would you have done in that situation? Would you have sought peace, as many in the British government suggested, or would you have continued fighting against seemingly impossible odds? Winston Churchill, the new British Prime Minister, did not hesitate. In one of the most famous speeches in history, he declared before the House of Commons on the 4th of June, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." But words, however inspiring they were, could not stop the German tanks. Great Britain needed something more concrete to survive, and what followed was one of the most decisive battles of the entire war. The Battle of Britain. Adolf Hitler expected that, with France defeated, the British would seek a negotiated settlement. From his perspective, there was no logical reason for Great Britain to continue the fight. Germany did not seek to destroy the British Empire, it only wanted freedom of action on the European continent. Why couldn't the two nations reach an understanding? But Churchill rejected all peace proposals. For him, any agreement with Nazi Germany was unacceptable. Great Britain would fight to the end, whatever the cost. Frustrated by British intransigence, Hitler ordered the preparation of Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain. The 16th of July of 1940, he issued Directive No. 16, which stated that the British Air Force must be eliminated to such an extent that it will be incapable of offering sustained resistance to the invading troops. Here was the fundamental problem that the Germans faced. Unlike Poland, France, or the Netherlands, Great Britain was separated from the continent by the English Channel. To invade the island, the Germans needed to transport their troops by sea. And to do that safely, they needed control of the airspace over the Channel and southern England. The Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, had suffered significant losses during the Norwegian campaign in April of 1940. It was in no position to challenge the Royal Navy in a direct confrontation. But if the Luftwaffe could destroy the Royal Air Force and dominate the skies, British ships would be vulnerable to aerial attacks. The invasion could proceed. Everything depended on the aerial battle that was about to begin. But was the Luftwaffe prepared for this task? The German Air Force had just fought an exhausting campaign over France and the Netherlands. Its planes needed maintenance, its pilots needed rest, its supplies needed to be replenished. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe had been designed as a close support force for the ground army, not as an instrument for independent strategic campaigns. Its bombers were medium, incapable of carrying the bomb loads necessary to cause strategically significant damage, and its fighters, although excellent, lacked the range to provide effective escort during prolonged missions over England. Hermann Göring, the corpulent commander of the Luftwaffe, dismissed these concerns. He promised Hitler that his air force could force Great Britain to surrender, without the need for a ground invasion. "Give me 4 weeks of good weather," he declared, "and the RAF will cease to exist." It was a promise that Göring would not be able to keep. On the other side of the Channel, the Royal Air Force prepared for the battle of its life. Fighter Command, under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, possessed approximately 700 combat airplanes, primarily Hurricanes and Spitfires. It was a smaller force than the Luftwaffe, but it was defending its own territory, with all the advantages that that implied. But the greatest British advantage was not visible from the air. It was an integrated air defence system that existed nowhere else in the world. Do you know the history of radar? This technology, which today we take for granted, was revolutionary in 1940. The chain-home radar stations, deployed along the British coast, could detect enemy aerial formations more than 160 kilometres away. This gave the British defenders invaluable early warning. But radar alone was not enough. What made the British system unique was how it integrated radar with other elements. The radar stations fed information to control centres that processed it and transmitted it to squadron commanders. They could then direct their fighters to intercept the attackers at the optimal time and place. This system, known as the Dowding system, allowed the British to manage the air battle in a way that the Germans could not match. RAF pilots did not need to constantly patrol the skies looking for the enemy. They could remain on the ground, conserving fuel and energy until they were directed toward a specific threat. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, lacked any comparable capability. Once a bomber formation took off, it received no communications or guidance from its headquarters. German pilots flew into battle with no idea of the location of British fighters and no way to coordinate the broader aerial battle. This asymmetry in command and control would be crucial in the following months. The Battle of Britain officially began the 10th of July of 1940, when the Luftwaffe attacked supply convoys in the English Channel. This initial phase, known as the Kanalkampf, or Channel Fight, was an attempt to draw fighter command into combat over the water. where shot-down pilots could not be rescued. Dowding, cautious and methodical, refused to take the bait. He committed only limited forces to defend the convoys, preserving his main force for the decisive battle he knew would come. The 13th of August, the Germans launched what they called Adlertag, Eagle Day. This was the main offensive, designed to destroy fighter command in the air and on the ground. More than 1,485 German missions attacked airfields and aircraft factories across southern England. The results were mixed. The Germans destroyed some airplanes on the ground and caused damage to several facilities, but they also lost 45 planes, while the RAF lost only 13. The Dowding system was working. The 15th of August became the most intense day of the battle up to that point. The Luftwaffe launched more than 2,000 missions, utilizing the three air fleets deployed against Great Britain in a coordinated effort. The Germans hoped to overwhelm the British defences with the magnitude of the attack. But that day, which the Germans would later call Black Thursday, turned into a disaster. RAF fighters, guided by radar and the control system, intercepted German formation after formation. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost 75 planes. The RAF had lost 34. How was it possible? How could a numerically inferior force inflict such losses on a larger attacker? The answer lay in the combination of technology, strategy, and leadership that the British had developed. Radar provided early warning, the Dowding system allowed an efficient response, and British pilots, fighting over their own territory, could return to combat even if they were shot down, whereas downed German pilots became prisoners. But the battle was far from over. The Germans continued their attacks, concentrating increasingly on fighter command airfields. The 18th of August, known as the hardest day, saw some of the fiercest combat of the entire battle. Kenley Airfield suffered severe damage. Biggin Hill was struck repeatedly. During the following weeks, the pressure on fighter command intensified. Sector airfields, the nerve centres of the defence system, were being systematically attacked. Pilot losses were beginning to exceed replacement capacity. The 31st of August, fighter command suffered its heaviest losses of the entire battle. 39 planes shot down and 14 pilots killed. Dowding was in a difficult position. If losses continued at this rate, fighter command would be incapacitated in a matter of weeks. But he could not simply retreat and cede control of the airspace. The German invasion would follow. And then, just when the situation seemed most desperate, the Germans made an error that would change the course of the battle. What happened? How did a German error save Great Britain? The night of the 24th of August, a formation of German bombers lost its way and dropped its bombs on London by mistake. Until that moment, both sides had avoided bombing each other's capitals. The accidental attack on London broke that taboo. Churchill immediately ordered a retaliatory bombing raid on Berlin. The damage caused was minimal, but the psychological effect was enormous. Hitler, furious that the capital of the Reich had been attacked, ordered the Luftwaffe to concentrate its attacks on London and other major British cities. This shift in strategy, from attacking airfields then to bombing cities, was exactly what fighter command needed. The severely damaged airfields could now be repaired. Exhausted pilots could rest. The defence system, which had been on the verge of collapse, began to recover. The 7th of September, nearly 400 German bombers attacked the docks of the East End of London, killing 430 civilians and wounding 1,600. It was the beginning of what would be known as the Blitz, 57 consecutive nights of bombings on the British capital. The scenes of devastation were horrific. Entire neighbourhoods reduced to rubble, families sheltering in subway stations, firefighters battling blazes that illuminated the night sky. The suffering of London civilians was immense. But strategically, the change of target was a gift for the defenders. While the Germans bombed cities, fighter command airfields remained free from attacks. The British fighter force, far from being destroyed, was recovering. The 15th of September, now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched its largest and most concentrated daylight assault on London. 965 German airplanes, including 348 bombers and 617 fighters, participated in the operations of that day. Fighter Command responded with everything it could muster. Squadron after squadron of Spitfires and Hurricanes threw themselves against the German formations. The scale of the attacks and the depth of their penetration into British territory allowed Fighter Command to assemble a sufficiently large and almost continuous defence to inflict immensely demoralising damage on the German bomber crews. The Germans suffered their heaviest losses of the month. More importantly, it became clear that Fighter Command was far from collapsing. Goering's claim that the RAF would be destroyed in weeks had proven to be completely false. 2 days later, the 17th of September, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion. The invasion of Great Britain would not occur. The Battle of Britain had been won. But why did the Germans fail? Was it simply bad luck, or were there deeper reasons? Historians have identified multiple factors that contributed to the German failure. The first and most fundamental was that the Luftwaffe simply was not designed for the task assigned to it. It was a tactical support force, optimized to work together with the army in land campaigns. It lacked the heavy bombers necessary to cause significant strategic damage and the long-range fighters necessary to provide effective escort over England. The second factor was the superiority of the British defence system. The Dowding system, integrating radar, observers and fighter squadrons into a single network, was the most advanced air defence system in the world at that time. It allowed the British to manage the battle efficiently, conserving resources and reducing the fatigue of their forces. The third factor was intelligence, or rather, the lack of it on the German side. The Luftwaffe suffered from acute and literally lethal ignorance about the enemy. The Germans knew of the existence of British radar, but did not understand how the RAF utilised it. Luftwaffe intelligence did not comprehend that Fighter Command was the first integrated air defence system in the world. The fourth factor was the change in strategy. By abandoning attacks against airfields to concentrate on cities, the Germans gave up the strategy that had the highest probability of success. This error, provoked by Hitler's emotional reaction to the bombing of Berlin, gave Fighter Command the respite it needed to recover. And finally, there was leadership. Hugh Dowding, the commander of Fighter Command, has been criticised by some for his excessive caution. Many of his contemporaries could not understand why he committed only a fraction of his total force to combat at any given time. But his operational concept of minimum effective response proved to be the correct strategy. By denying the Luftwaffe even the possibility of a decisive victory in the air, Dowding secured a strategic victory. The Battle of Britain was the first significant defeat of Nazi Germany. It demonstrated that the German military machine was not invincible, and it kept Great Britain in the war, providing a base from which the liberation of Europe would eventually be launched. But let us return now to our original question about France. What connection exists between the Blitzkrieg in France and the Battle of Britain? The connection is deeper than it might seem at first glance. Both campaigns revealed the strengths and weaknesses of the German approach to war. In France, speed, surprise, and concentration of forces allowed for an astounding victory. But in England, where these tactics could not be applied in the same way, the Germans failed. The so-called Blitzkrieg worked when certain conditions were met. The attacker needed to be able to concentrate overwhelming forces at specific points. The defender needed to be disorganized or poorly positioned, and the campaign needed to be short before logistical problems could accumulate. In France, all these conditions were met. The Allies deployed their forces incorrectly. Strategic surprise in the Ardennes permitted the concentration of power, and the campaign was short enough that German logistical limitations did not matter. In England, none of these conditions existed. The British could not be surprised in the same manner thanks to radar. Concentration of forces over the Channel was difficult due to the range restrictions of German fighters. and the campaign dragged on long enough for the structural weaknesses of the Luftwaffe to become evident. The lesson here is that tactics that work in one context can fail completely in another. Blitzkrieg was not a magic formula for victory. It was a set of practices that exploited specific circumstances. When those circumstances changed, the results also changed. This lesson would be reinforced later in the war, when the Germans attempted to apply the same tactics in the Soviet Union. Initially, they achieved spectacular victories similar to those in France, but the vastness of Soviet territory, the harshness of the climate, and the Soviet determination to keep fighting eventually turned Blitzkrieg into a war of attrition that Germany could not win. Now, let us delve into some additional aspects of the French campaign that deserve attention. Details that reveal the complexity of what actually occurred and that challenge the simplified narratives we often hear. Did you know that the Germans were almost stopped at several moments of the campaign? We have mentioned some of these moments, but they are worth examining more closely. The Meuse crossing at Sedan, for example, was much more contested than conventional narratives suggest. The French defences at Sedan did not collapse instantaneously. Some units fought with considerable determination. The bunker of La Boulette, defended by a small French detachment, held out for hours against German assaults, causing numerous casualties before finally being reduced. If more French units had fought with the same determination, the crossing could have been much more costly for the Germans. Furthermore, German coordination was not as perfect as is often described. There was confusion over orders, delays in the advance, and moments when different units were not synchronized. German success was due as much to French disorganization as to German brilliance. Another critical moment was the period between the 14th and the 16th of May, when the Germans consolidated their bridgeheads over the Meuse and began their advance to the west. During these 48 hours, German armoured columns were extremely vulnerable. Their flanks were completely exposed. Their supply lines stretched dangerously. The French launched several counterattacks during this period, but none was executed with sufficient force or coordination. The aerial attacks against the bridges over the Meuse were repelled with devastating losses. The ground counterattacks were too small and too late. Why? The answer has to do with the structure of the French command system. French armoured reserves were fragmented into multiple units, dispersed across the entire front. Assembling them for a concentrated counterattack required time that the French did not have, and orders that the command system could not transmit quickly enough. Additionally, French doctrine emphasized careful preparation before any offensive operation. French commanders were reluctant to launch improvised attacks without adequate reconnaissance, artillery coordination, and aerial support. But while they waited to prepare properly, the Germans advanced kilometre after kilometre. This contrast between French caution and German aggressiveness was perhaps the most important factor in the outcome of the campaign. The Germans were willing to accept risks that the French considered unacceptable, and in this particular case, the risks paid off. But what if the French had been more aggressive? What if they had launched a massive counterattack before the Germans could consolidate their positions? Military historians have simulated these alternative scenarios, and the results are fascinating. In many simulations, a well-executed French counterattack during the first 48 hours after the Meuse crossing results in a catastrophic German defeat. The panzer divisions, trapped with their supply lines cut, would have been destroyed or forced to surrender. Of course, these simulations assume a level of competence and coordination that the French probably could not achieve given their command structures and doctrine, but they illustrate how close the outcome was to being different. What happened to the main protagonists of the campaign after 1940? Heinz Guderian, the apostle of armoured warfare, continued commanding panzer forces during the invasion of the Soviet Union. He had spectacular initial successes, but came into conflict with Hitler over strategic issues and was relieved of command in December of 1941. He returned to active duty later in the war, eventually becoming Chief of the Army General Staff, He survived the war and died in 1954. Erich von Manstein, the architect of the plan that conquered France, became one of the most respected commanders of the Wehrmacht. He commanded the siege of Sevastopol and the counter-offensive that recaptured Kharkov in 1943. He was dismissed by Hitler in 1944 due to strategic disagreements. After the war, he was tried for war crimes and sentenced to 18 years in prison, although he was released after 4. He died in 1973. Erwin Rommel, who had commanded the 7th Panzer Division during the French campaign, would become famous as the Desert Fox for his campaigns in North Africa. Later, he commanded the German defences in Normandy. In 1944, he was implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler and was forced to commit suicide. On the Allied side, destinies were diverse. Maurice Gamelin, the French Supreme Commander, whose decisions contributed to the disaster, was arrested by the Vichy regime and later deported to Germany, where he spent the rest of the war in captivity. He died in 1958. Maxime Weygand, who replaced Gamelin and negotiated the armistice, served under the Vichy regime before being arrested by the Germans in 1942. After the war, he was briefly detained by French authorities, but was never tried. He died in 1965 at 98 years of age. Charles de Gaulle, the colonel who had advocated for armoured warfare and who refused to accept defeat, became the leader of Free France. He returned triumphantly to Paris in August of 1944 and became the first president of the French Fifth Republic. He died in 1970. Philippe Pétain, the marshal who had signed the armistice and led the collaborationist Vichy regime, was tried for treason after the war. He was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He died in captivity in 1951 at 95 years of age. And Winston Churchill, whose leadership kept Great Britain in the war when everything seemed lost, guided his country through the darkest years to ultimate victory. He lost the 1945 elections, but returned as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955. He died in 1965, revered as one of the greatest leaders in British history. What final lessons can we extract from this history? The first lesson is about the importance of adaptability. The French lost because they could not adapt to a type of war for which they were not prepared. Their institutions, their doctrine, their mentality, everything was oriented toward a type of conflict that no longer existed. When the environment changed, they could not change with it. The second lesson is about the danger of past victories. France had won the First World War, and that victory shaped its preparation for the Second. The French assumed that what had worked before would work again. They did not anticipate that the enemy had also learned from the past and had developed new ways of fighting. The third lesson is about the uncertainty inherent in war. Even the best designed plans can fail, and risky plans sometimes triumph. The outcome of the French campaign was far from inevitable. Small changes at any of multiple points could have produced very different results. The fourth lesson is about the importance of leadership. German commanders, with their aggressiveness and initiative, exploited opportunities that their opponents could not match. Allied commanders, trapped in rigid systems and obsolete doctrines, could not respond effectively. Leadership matters, sometimes more than material resources. And the fifth lesson, perhaps the most important, is about the fragility of what we take for granted. France in 1940 was a great power with a powerful army and committed allies. It seemed secure, and yet it collapsed in 6 weeks. Institutions that seem solid can be more fragile than we think. Vigilance and constant adaptation are the price of survival. The fall of France remains one of the most studied events in military history. Decades later, historians continue debating the causes and consequences, the missed opportunities, and the errors made. Each generation finds new angles from which to examine these events, new questions to ask, new lessons to extract. But beyond abstract lessons, we must remember that this was a human tragedy of immense proportions. Millions of people saw their lives shattered by these events. Soldiers died in fields that would soon be forgotten. Civilians were displaced from their homes. Families were separated. An entire nation was humiliated and occupied. The memory of 1940 scarred France for generations. The trauma of defeat, the shame of occupation, the division between those who collaborated and those who resisted. All these wounds took decades to heal, if they ever fully healed. And for the rest of the world, the fall of France was a warning that the established order could be brought down with terrifying speed, a warning that preparation for the past does not guarantee security in the future, a warning that even the most powerful nations can be vulnerable if they do not adapt to changing threats. That warning remains relevant today, almost 9 decades later. We live in a rapidly changing world, where old certainties are no longer secure. The lessons of 1940, about adaptability, about vigilance, about the fragility of institutions, are as pertinent now as they were then. Because history, as they say, does not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes. And those who do not learn from the catastrophes of the past run the risk of repeating them in the future. Now, let us explore a final aspect of this history that is rarely discussed, the psychological impact of the defeat. How do societies process a trauma as great as the fall of France? How is national identity rebuilt after such a complete humiliation? For France, this process was long and painful. Immediately after the defeat, multiple narratives emerged to explain what had happened. Some blamed the politicians of the Third Republic. Others blamed the generals. Others pointed to the moral decadence of French society. And others, darker still, blamed the Jews, the communists, the Freemasons, any group that could serve as a scapegoat. The Vichy regime adopted this last perspective, presenting the defeat as a divine punishment for the sins of the Republic. Pétain promised a national revolution that would purge France of the elements that had supposedly caused its fall. This ideology justified collaboration with the Nazis and the anti-Semitic policies that resulted in the deportation of tens of thousands of French Jews to extermination camps. De Gaulle's Free France offered an alternative narrative. According to this version, the defeat had been an accident, a temporary stumble in the long history of French greatness. The true France had never surrendered. It had continued fighting in exile and through the resistance. The liberation of 1944 would vindicate this vision. After the war, the Gaullist narrative became the official history of France. Collaboration was minimized, the resistance glorified. The myth was created of a nation that had stood united against the occupier. This myth served to unite a divided society and restore national pride, but it also hid uncomfortable truths that would eventually emerge. In the 70s and 80s, a new generation of historians began to question the official narrative. They investigated the extent of collaboration, French participation in the deportation of Jews, the complexities of life under occupation. Works like Vichy France by Robert Paxton and The Vichy Syndrome by Henry Rousseau forced the French to confront aspects of their past that they preferred to forget. This process of confronting the past was painful but necessary. Only by acknowledging the full reality of what had happened could France truly overcome the trauma of 1940. Official apologies for the French government's collaboration in the Holocaust, which arrived in the 90s, were an important step in this process. Today, almost 86 years after the events, France has managed to integrate the experience of 1940 into its national identity in a more nuanced way. The defeat is no longer a taboo, but a subject of open historical discussion. The lessons are studied in military schools and museums. The occupation period is examined with honesty, acknowledging both acts of resistance and those of collaboration. But the scars remain. The debate over French identity, over who is truly French and what it means to be French, remains intense. The divisions between different memories of the war, the different interpretations of the past, still resonate in contemporary politics. In a certain sense, the shadow of 1940 will never completely disappear. It was a defining moment in the history of France, a turning point that changed the course of the nation. For better or for worse, the French of today are who they are partly because of what's occurred in those 6 weeks of May and June of 1940. What does all this tell us about the Blitzkrieg? Was it really pure luck? The answer, as we have seen, is complex. The Blitzkrieg, as we popularly understand it, is partly a myth created after the war to explain what seemed inexplicable. The Germans did not employ a doctrine called Blitzkrieg. There was no lightning war manual. What existed was a set of practices, developed over years of reflection and experimentation, that proved to be extraordinarily effective in the specific circumstances of May of 1940. Luck played an important role. The Germans were fortunate that the Allies did not attack their columns in the Ardennes. They were fortunate that the Meuse crossing succeeded on the first attempt. They were fortunate that Allied counterattacks were poorly coordinated. Without this luck, the result could have been very different. But luck alone does not explain the victory. The Germans placed themselves in a position to take advantage of their good fortune through bold planning, aggressive execution, and an adaptability that their opponents could not match. They created the conditions in which luck could matter, and the Allies, for their part, created the conditions for their own defeat. Their rigid planning, their obsolete doctrine, their slow command system, their inability to adapt to changing circumstances, all this contributed to a disaster that, seen in retrospect, seems almost inevitable, but which at the time was not at all. The fall of France in 1940 was the result of the intersection of multiple factors: preparation, execution, doctrine, leadership, technology, geography, psychology, and yes, luck. No single factor can explain what happened. Only by understanding the complete complexity of the situation can we truly learn from it. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. History is rarely simple. Victories and defeats rarely have single causes. The events that change the world are the product of countless decisions, large and small, taken by countless individuals in circumstances they could not completely control. The Blitzkrieg was neither pure genius nor pure luck. It was both things, and much more. And the fall of France was neither inevitable nor accidental. It was the result of a perfect storm of factors that combined in a way that nobody had foreseen and that few could have predicted. Remembering this helps us maintain humility before the complexity of history, and it reminds us that the future, like the past, is more uncertain and more malleable than we often believe. We have reached the end of this account, a journey through 6 weeks that changed the world. From the Ardennes to Dunkirk, from Paris to London, we have followed the course of one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in history. But history never truly ends. The events of 1940 reverberate to this day. The lessons they offer remain relevant, and the questions they raise about war, about leadership, about the fragility of human institutions remain as urgent as ever. The next time you hear about the Blitzkrieg, remember what you have learned here. Remember that the reality was more complex than the myth. Remember that the German victory was far from inevitable. And remember that, in history as in life, the final outcome often hangs by finer threads than we imagine. What other histories of the Second World War would you like to know? What other myths would you like to see examined? Tell us in the comments. That was all. Until the next video.